everybody, welcome to Kayla's Speech Sessions. Today we're going to be discussing the speech chain, specifically highlighting the first stage, neurology, the second stage, respiration, and the third stage, phonation. Let us begin with neurology by getting into the nitty-gritty. First, it is vital to understand the anatomy of the brain and from there how it relates to speech. As it pertains to speech, it is important to recognize that the main brain, also known as the cerebrum, is divided into two hemispheres, left and right. The left hemisphere mostly impacts language, both expressive, so speaking and writing, and receptive, so listening and reading. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, mostly impacts cognition, specifically attention, executive function, memory, and more. A major connector between these two hemispheres is the corpus callosum, allowing for communication to take place from left to right and vice versa. Possibly the most basic thing that will ever be taught in any discussion about the main brain, also known as the cerebrum, are its four lobes within each hemisphere. So, what are they? They are the frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. Some important landmarks found within the frontal lobe that pertain to speech include Broca's area, which is responsible for expressive language, and the precentral gyrus, which is also known as the motor cortex or motor strip. Moving along, the occipital lobe does not have any particular speech function, serving mainly a visual function as it houses the calcarine sulcus, which is the primary visual cortex. The parietal lobe houses the postcentral gyrus, also known as the sensory cortex or the sensory strip. This rests next to the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe. Lastly, the temporal lobe houses Heschl's gyrus, which is the primary auditory cortex, and Wernicke's area, which is responsible for receptive language. The arcuate fasciculus is another significant structure to note. The arcuate fasciculus is interhemispheric, meaning that it exists within a hemisphere. Its primary function is to aid in the expression and reception of language, connecting the two. Moving on to the subcortical structures of the brain, also known as those structures that lie beneath and deeper to the cortical structures discussed above, we will begin with the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for driving and processing behaviors and emotions, as well as for participating in the formation of memories. There is also the basal ganglia, which controls motor movement and dampens any excessive movement. Note this because it will be important later. There is also the brainstem, comprised of the medulla, which regulates breathing and heart rate, the midbrain, which controls eye movement and various auditory visual reflexes, and the pons, which connects the medulla to the midbrain, as well as the cerebellum, which is the mini brain that connects to the brainstem and helps to coordinate movement. Again, this will be important later. Next, we have the hippocampus, which many of you may already be familiar with, as it is quite known to be associated with memory, consolidating and converting our short-term memories into long-term ones. There is also the hypothalamus, which controls the autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, pituitary gland. Essentially, it produces hormones that regulate much of the body's vital functions. Lastly, we have the thalamus, which is responsible for relaying all our sensory information from each of our five senses, with the exception of smell, as that is relayed by the olfactory bulb. We will now proceed by taking a moment for the cerebrovascular system, also known as how blood travels to the brain. The blood that reaches the brain is rich in glucose and oxygen, which the brain needs to sustain itself and the functions that it carries out. So, how does blood get from the aorta, or the heart, to the brain in the first place? Well, through the carotid artery and the vertebral artery. The carotid system and vertebral system are connected by what is known as a circle of Willis, helping to promote an equal distribution of blood to the brain, as the carotid artery serves the anterior and lateral parts of the brain, whereas the vertebral artery serves the posterior parts of the brain. This network is comprised of both the carotid and vertebral arteries, as well as the anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, and posterior communicating artery. It is important to note that the posterior communicating artery is more specifically responsible for connecting both the carotid and vertebral systems mentioned above. What is also significant to our understanding is knowing what artery connects the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum, which would be the anterior communicating artery at the anterior cerebral artery. This network of arteries is vital to us because in the event that one of our major arteries is blocked, there still remains a way for blood to reroute and supply to our brains. It is necessary that we understand how messages travel through the brain to emphasize the importance of all that has just been shared. Neurons serve a huge role in this understanding, as they are the most central unit of the nervous system, responsible for transmitting all the information that the body receives. Despite being small in size, each neuron is characterized by a complex anatomy that we will begin to analyze and discuss now. Following the path of an impulse and moving from the most proximal portion to the most distal, we have the cell body, containing the nucleus. Then there are the dendrites, which surround the cell body and transmit information towards it. On the opposite end of that, there is the axon that conducts information away from the cell body and is split into myelinated segments that are covered by a fatty white substance that speeds neural conduction, myelin sheath. Between these myelinated segments are the nodes of Ranvier, which are important in conduction as they are the location of a process called action potential that we will discuss in further detail soon enough. At the end of the axon are the telodendria, which contain terminal buttons at their ends. These terminal buttons themselves contain synaptic vesicles, which contain neurotransmitters that help to activate the next neuron in the chain. Now, let us return to action potential as promised. So, what is action potential and why is it important? Essentially, action potential assists with the transmission of an impulse described above, with the change in electrical potential occurring when the cell membrane is stimulated adequately to permit ion exchange. The neuron begins as polarized, then goes through depolarization, and then turns to repolarization throughout the axon until the terminal ends. This change in electrical potential throughout the extent of the neuron is what carries the impulse and permits its release through the neurotransmitters, aiding in communication with other neurons. When considering a deficit like childhood ataxia, characterized by impaired coordination of movement and balance according to the Italian Journal of Pediatrics, how does brain function play a role? According to what has just been cited, such a deficit is primarily caused by dysfunction of the complex circuitry connecting the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and cerebral cortex, once again according to the Italian Journal of Pediatrics. Considering what was mentioned earlier about the basal ganglia and cerebellum specifically, and their shared function in motor movement, it comes at no surprise that impairment to both would result in decreased motor efficiency and the common symptom of gait unsteadiness, also known as an inability to maintain physical stability. Now, everyone knows the basics of breathing, but how exactly does that breathing impact speech? The first step in both rest inspiration and speech inspiration is a contraction of the diaphragm, which is lined by a type of pleural lining, parietal lining. When the diaphragm contracts, the other type of pleural lining that lines the lungs, visceral lining, pulls the lungs downward and successfully increases their volume. The pressure of these parietal linings remains negative, but turns more negative upon the increase of lung volume. As a result, the pressure of the alveoli, sites of gas exchange that are housed within the lungs, decreases like the general pressure of the lungs. Since the pressure of air found in the atmosphere is now higher than the pressure of air found in the lungs, air flows into them. This relates to Boyle's law, specifically the idea that pressure and volume share an inverse relationship, as well as the principle that gas always moves from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. What separates rest inspiration from speech inspiration, however, is the inclusion of the accessory muscles of inspiration. Since speech occurs on the release of air during expiration, more air must be inspired to support such a large expiration for speech. The three accessory muscles of inspiration that permit these larger volumes of air to be inspired through elevation of the rib cage are the external intercostals, the interchondral portion of the internal intercostal muscles, and the sternocleidomastoid. Now, moving on to expiration. The first step once again involves the diaphragm. Rather than contracting, however, it is expanded. Such an expansion of the diaphragm causes the visceral lining of the lungs to return them upwards and successfully decreases their volume while increasing their pressure, more specifically the alveolar pressure. Thus, the intrapleural pressure turns less negative upon the decrease of lung, more specifically alveoli volume. As a result, the higher pressure of air found in the lungs compared to the lower pressure of air found in the atmosphere causes for air to flow out of the lungs. This would be as simple as it gets for rest expiration. However, for speech expiration, the process is a bit more complex than what was just described. For speech expiration, the engagement of the muscles of force expiration are vital components to the entire process. The three muscles of force expiration that depress the ribcage to decrease the volume of the lungs and simultaneously increase their pressure are the innermost intercostal muscles, internal intercostals, and transverse thoracis. Another vital component to speech expiration is the process of checking action, which essentially serves to check or sustain the accessory muscles of inspiration as long as possible to prevent lung deflation, with the muscles of force expiration tapping in to maintain enough air for the production of speech upon the release of air. Crucial to understanding the difference between rest breathing and speech breathing is the drastic distinction in the expiration to inspiration ratio, which is 40% to 60% at rest and transforms to a whopping 90% to 10% during speech. Now, since we have already discussed how ataxia manifests itself in neurology, let us look towards how ataxia manifests itself in respiration. In some severe cases, ataxia can result in respiratory distress from the incoordination of muscle, more specifically diaphragmatic movement, that the cerebellar impairment highlighted earlier plays a role in. A severe case like this one would often be seen in those children diagnosed with ataxia telangiectasia, more specifically. More often than not, ataxia bronchiectasia can transform into lung diseases like bronchiectasis, recurrent pneumonia, lung fibrosis, and interstitial lung disease, ILD. This is from Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases. Respiratory therapy that includes inspiratory and expiratory muscle training, according to the Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases once again, is necessary in these instances because of the difficulty that breathing presents with breathlessness or insufficiency of air. While the speech chain is technically made up of 5 parts, with the 4th part being resonance and the 5th part being articulation, phonation will be the final part discussed during this video podcast. So buckle up and keep right on listening along and watching attentively. Let us begin by connecting the former part of the speech chain, respiration, to the latter part, phonation. In the last segment, it was mentioned that respiration, more specifically inspiration, begins upon contraction of the diaphragm that results in air being transported to the lungs because of their increased volume and subsequently decreased pressure. However, how does this air reach the lungs in the first place? Well, it travels through the trachea, also known as the windpipe, to meet the bronchial tubes that connect to the lungs. The trachea is not necessarily important to our understanding of phonation, but what is, however, is the larynx, which sits at the top of the trachea. The larynx contains the vocal folds, otherwise known as the primary source of sound for speech. The vocal folds are made up of 5 different types of tissue. From most superficial to most deep, we have the epithelium, which is made up of epithelial tissue and has a protective quality. The superficial lamina propria, which is made up of elastin and therefore has an elastic quality. The intermediate lamina propria, which is made up of both collagen and elastin, therefore providing a strengthening and supportive quality as well as an elastic quality. The deep lamina propria, which is made up of just collagen, therefore having a strengthening and supportive quality. And the thyroarytenoid muscle, which is made up of the thyromuscularis and the thyrovocalis. Together, the deep lamina propria and the intermediate lamina propria make up the vocal ligament. Understanding the different compositions and qualities of the 5 tissues of the vocal folds makes the myoelastic aerodynamic principle more clear and obvious, which we will move into later upon careful consideration of the 3 stages of phonation. Prior to that, we will center our attention around the different cartilages and intrinsic muscles that are involved in speech production. The larynx is comprised of 3 paired cartilages and 3 unpaired cartilages. The 3 paired cartilages of the larynx include the arytenoid cartilage, corniculate cartilage, and cuneiform cartilage, while the 3 unpaired cartilages include the cricoid cartilage, the epiglottis, and the thyroid cartilage. The intrinsic muscles of the larynx have both their specific points of insertion and specific points of origin on these laryngeal cartilages, something that can be deduced from the combination of cartilages present in their names, and make fine adjustments to the vocal folds through abducting or opening, adducting or closing, relaxing, and tensing them. The sole abductor that opens the vocal folds for breathing and the cessation of phonation is the posterior cricoarytenoid. Now, referring back to cartilages to provide an example, the point of insertion for this muscle would be the arytenoid cartilage, and the point of origin would be the cricoid cartilage. In contrast, the 3 adductors that close the vocal folds for airway protection and phonation are the lateral cricoarytenoid, the oblique cricoarytenoid, and the transverse arytenoid. Moving forward, the sole relaxer that decreases the tension of the vocal folds for changes in pitch is the thyromuscularis, which was mentioned earlier as it makes a part of the thyroarytenoid muscle. On the opposite end of that are the 2 tensors that increase the tension of the vocal folds for changes in pitch, which are the cricothyroid and the thyrovocalis, making up the other part of the thyroarytenoid muscle. Now, returning to the myoelastic aerodynamic principle, let us discuss how all the anatomy mentioned above plays a role in the physiology of the vocal folds through the 3 stages of phonation. The first stage of phonation is initiation, in which the vocal folds merely adduct and enter the airstream. From there, sustained phonation takes place, in which the pressure below the vocal folds, otherwise known as the subglottic pressure, causes the vocal folds to peel apart from bottom to top because of the elastin found in the intermediate lamina propria and the superficial lamina propria. Here, the myoelastic aerodynamic principle is in full effect because of the vocal folds' ability to stretch and travel back to their initial state, combined with a change in airflow. Bernoulli's effect, otherwise known as the idea that the constriction of airflow will lead to decreased pressure and therefore increased air velocity, works in tandem with this myoelastic aerodynamic principle. The narrow opening between the vocal folds described above decreases the air pressure and increases the air velocity, which causes for the vocal folds to be sucked back together again and again. The final stage that follows is termination, in which the vocal folds simply abduct and exit the airstream once more for breathing. As it pertains to phonation, childhood ataxia can often be seen to negatively impact speech because of motor incoordination following impairment to the cerebellum once again. This is otherwise known as ataxic dysarthria. Speech of those with ataxic dysarthria may be characterized by imprecise consonants, monotony, prolonged intervals, imprecise vowels, stereotypic intonational patterns, equalized stress, and short phrases, according to the Journal of Communication Disorders. In short, a form of slurring may be heard in an individual's speech. In addition, the quality of speech may be driven by the perception of harshness, strange strangled voice, and glottal fry, once again according to the Journal of Communication Disorders. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day.